The first trailer for Rings of Power Season 2 is dropped, and boy has it kicked over a hornet's nest. Might as well add my 2 cents. Plenty of people have already addressed the issues with lore, characters, and whatnot. I want to talk about the problems with the trailer in the context of 2 of my areas of expertise, architecture and aesthetics. Let's look at this Anti-Tolkien Abomination, shall we? Oops, did I just subtly tip my hand?
Architectural Artcast.
I want to begin by framing this conversation with 2 ideas. First, architecture is about communication. Architecture is meant to provoke thought and evoke emotions. Architecture always tells a story. Second, making a movie, or in this case, TV show, is no different than any other design process. Every design decision is a conscious choice. It's meant to be that way. It's part of the artistic expression, part of what the director or showrunner is trying to communicate to the audience. I'm going to begin with architecture and then move on to aesthetics. Let's begin with the dwarves. What do we know about their architecture? They're genius engineers, capable of pushing rock to its limits, balancing massive and heavy with light and delicate. Khazad-dûm was a showcase of everything the dwarves were capable of doing. It was open, airy, and full of light. So much light that there were gardens deep underground. It was described as a paradise. If that's the case, what the is this? This isn't the work of brilliant engineers and masters of stone. You have basic geometric shapes, and the stonework isn't sharp and crisp. It's crude and imprecise. This isn't an open, airy space full of light. It's dark, dank, claustrophobic. You can almost smell the mildew. And this is supposed to be the council chamber of the elites. Here we have another space that's considered to be good enough for the king of the dwarves to receive guests, to accept gifts, in this case, one of the rings of power. There's nothing elegant and sophisticated about this space. It's still dark, dank, and claustrophobic. The design of the columns is basic, almost clunky. Stonework is still crude, and the way the columns meet the ceiling is almost an afterthought. Things don't get any better with the bridge. You got large scale covered. I'll grant you it's massive, but it doesn't look like anything an artist or craftsman would have created. It's clunky and awkward. And I'm going to keep using the same word over and over again, inelegant. There's nothing in these spaces to indicate they're unique to dwarves and dwarven culture. If anything, they're closer to how I imagined orc cities. What does Tolkien tell us about elven architecture? It's as beautiful and ephemeral as the elves themselves. They can and do work in stone, but they prefer lighter, more ephemeral materials. They love light, delicate details that mimic the forms of nature, closer to what we would call Art Nouveau. And their buildings are often tall and slender, mimicking trees. This has nothing to do with elven detailing. It looks like a fire escape on the tenement in South St. Louis. I'm assuming that this is an elven space. That's the fundamental problem. I'm being asked to assume. You all see that column back and to the right? Yeah, the details are slightly different than the ones in Khazad-dûm, but it looks like the same mind came up with both columns. The same hands carved both columns, using the same crude techniques. The wall behind the actor, it's a bland, generic, vaguely medieval, vaguely fantasy stone wall. I'm assuming it's part of an elven city because of the Gothic arches, the pointed arches. But I don't have any real reason to justify that assumption. I have no clue who this city is supposed to be associated with. The curved wall and the architecture of the tower vaguely evokes imagery of Helm's Deep. But as the camera pans, look at the tower next to the D in darkness. It looks like they just copied and pasted the Duomo from Florence. And the closer you look at these large cityscapes, looks like there's lots of copying and pasting of historic buildings. Now we come to what I assume is Numenor. Vaguely late Roman Byzantine architecture. In particular, look at the building center right with the dome. It just looks like Hagia Sophia with the towers knocked off. and there's something not quite right about the scale. Look again at that Hagia Sophia domed building. Look closely at the arched entryway. Looks pretty big, right? In the next scene, from the interior of the dome building looking out, look how small that entryway becomes. Look how big the people are in relation to the rest of the building. That means that dome building is a lot smaller than it appears in that first image. You scale the whole city down, and suddenly houses become way too small for people to use. Architecture is meant to communicate. The architecture presented in the Rings of Power fails to communicate. Well, no, that's not true. On one hand, they're trying to evoke the architecture of Jackson's trilogies, and on the other hand, they're trying to borrow the meanings associated with famous buildings. They failed to understand why the architecture in Jackson's trilogies worked. They failed to understand why meanings get associated with famous buildings. They created a collage, a pastiche. It's like a small child banging away on a piano. Yeah, there are distinct individual notes, but they're played at random. They just become noise. All right, Mr. Smarty Pants, you think you could do better? Yes, I do. Half asleep. It's not because I'm all that. It's because this stuff is complete and utter. If I'd been asked to join the design process, the first thing I would have done is read every single work that Tolkien ever wrote about architecture in Middle-earth. I would have examined all of his drawings. I would have looked at every illustration from every published work. I would have studied how the Jackson trilogy developed their architecture. Sounds like common sense, right? Apparently not so much for the people working on the Rings of Power. The architecture they came up with is antithetical to everything Tolkien. If there were any architectural consultants on this project, they should be ashamed and embarrassed for what we saw. The architecture of the Rings of Power may be horrendous, but the aesthetics are worse. When I talk about aesthetics, I mean the study of beauty. What did Tolkien tell us about the elves and the people of Numenor? How they looked. We're told that the elves were beautiful and ethereal, tall, graceful, elegant, perfect in face and form. The people of Numenor were bigger, stronger, and more powerful than ordinary humans. They were stunningly handsome and beautiful. Again, perfect in face and form. We are told, as one of the most powerful elves to have ever lived, Galadriel's beauty was so mesmerizing that along with her wisdom and kindness, it only took one meeting for Gimli to overcome his racial prejudice and to become completely enamored with Galadriel. Let me ask you all a question. Who's enamored by this? Who believes that Morfydd Clark's Galadriel is capable of enamoring a hard-bitten, cynical old dwarf like Gimli? Who believes that these are elves, beautiful and ethereal, perfect of face and form? Who believes that this is Anatar, Lord of Gifts, so beautiful, so seductive with his words, he's able to trick the elves, the wise elves, into making an almost fatal mistake? Who believes that this is a group of Numenorians, the biggest, strongest, most powerful, and most beautiful humans to have ever existed? Doesn't even look like it belongs in the story about Tolkien. Looks like a scene from Game of Thrones. Every single design decision is a conscious choice. They can hire whoever they want. They can make their characters look like whatever they want them to look like. They chose to hire Morfydd Clark to play Galadriel because they were going for a very specific design aesthetic. In a previous video, I'll link it down in the description below if you all are interested, I talked about the science of beauty. The short answer, beauty's math. There is an ideal ratio for face and body for both men and women. We are biologically programmed to value and seek out beauty. The last number of years, influenced by academia, Hollywood has sought to social engineer a new beauty standard. They want to destroy traditional masculinity and femininity and replace it with some vague middle ground, just like Morfydd Clark. Fads come and go, and this fad's going to fail sooner than later because they're trying to go against biology. You're already starting to see the pushback as people are rejecting what's being sold. But Hollywood has a much bigger problem that's emblematic in the Rings of Power: the failure of an entire institution, art. The last 40 years have seen the wealthy and powerful systematically drive the middle class out of the arts. The middle class are who drive artistic creation within a culture. Without the middle class, there is no longer any creative drive within the arts. The wealthy and powerful, they aren't capable of creativity. The only art they produce is derivative. The only value they place on art is for propaganda. They openly hate and despise the middle class. They refuse to do any projects that promote middle class attitudes and values, say like heroicism. In this current climate, it is impossible for Tolkien to be adapted properly. The ideas expressed in Tolkien's work are way too middle class. He has to be mocked, ridiculed, and demonized, convince as many people possible to want nothing to do with Tolkien's work. Mark my words, at some point, they're going to try to ban Tolkien. You know these projects coming out based on Tolkien's work? I have a feeling you all are going to be very disappointed in the final product. The good news, the Rings of Power are a death rattle. Hollywood is dying. People aren't interested in their hate and bile. Even better news, middle-class creativity hasn't gone away. It's going to find an outlet. And in the last couple years, the gatekeepers have gone away, and the barrier to entry has gotten the lowest it's ever been in recorded history. More people are getting involved in creativity. More people are getting involved in the arts. Get involved. Do something. Be creative. Now is the time for everyone. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, you all be safe. If you all are still here, I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like the video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell, and you can hear me yammer on about something else next time. Hey, sweetie. How are you? Okay.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.